Chapter 37. It was late evening, and outside in the darkness, the autumn rain was falling without cease. Vivian sat at her kitchen table, her elbows on its surface, and her head in her hands. She was crying large, wet splotches onto the tablecloth. In front of her, there was a bottle of bourbon, now only about a quarter full, and a small glass. There were many points in her life when she had felt alone, or helpless, or miserable, but she had never felt anything like this. This was agony. This was misery without bottom. This was pain that ate at her like flames. Pain that no one could ever be told of, since no one could possibly understand it. Tears did not seem to diminish it, but only to feed it further. 4 years had passed, but on every anniversary of their split, the horror and the grief was there, just as it had been when it was still fresh. "I'm making no headway," she thought, cradling her head in her hands. "I'm getting nowhere. It has been 4 years, and I am still overwhelmed with grief at every one of these bitter anniversaries. Is this the life that I wanted when I sent him away?" Oh, certainly, on most days it was better now, but only relatively speaking. It was not hard to see improvement when comparing her life now to the constant veil of destructive misery that it had been right after her return from New Orleans. The last time, when she and Gregory had been pulled apart, Vivian had moved on to something new, had uprooted her life, and moved to a different city with her new husband. This time, however, she had had nothing new to move on to. She had no husband, and there was no dream of a new, possibly happier life to dull any of the pain of losing Gregory. She had returned home from New Orleans to the apartment that Gregory had bought and furnished for her, where she was entirely surrounded by him and by the ghostly memory of him, where every single item in it reminded her of him acutely at every glance around the rooms, and she could still vividly remember everything every time she walked in, so that she had had to swallow back tears. At first, she couldn't bring herself to sit on the sofas, so instead, she sat once more in her small armchair, as she had when she had first moved to New York, and like then, she hugged her knees to her chest and sobbed. How suddenly everything could change. How suddenly a huge blessing could turn into a knife twisting in a wound. It was as if she were ensconced in a misery-producing machine rather than in a refuge that was her home. She wanted to flee the apartment, but where could she go, and what to tell Sophie? She wanted to let it all burn, to be rid of it, but then her mind would change again, and she would cry every time something of his broke or ripped or needed to be replaced, and she shouted at Sophie for throwing the living room pillows on the floor, not because this made the room a mess, but because the pillows were from him. "This is all I have from him," she thought despondently. "This is all I am left with. These belongings. This background scenery to the sorrow of my daily life." How different from when Chip had left, and she had cold-bloodedly thrown out every single thing he had ever given her that she could afford to live without, keeping only her golden wedding band because she cynically thought it might come in handy at times. Oh, how different it was this time, having lost a man that she had truly loved. She couldn't sit down and sew without thinking of Gregory, both here in New York and at her mother's old apartment back in New Orleans. So she avoided sewing like the plague, thinking bitterly that she would have to take it all up again in spring, when the annual wedding-related orders became too lucrative to turn down, and she always needed the extra money. At night, she crawled with great reluctance to her bedroom, always wondering vaguely if she should sleep on the floor to avoid having to lay in the dark with his shadow curled about her. At other times, she found herself conflicted and not ready to move his memory aside. His copy of Bulfinch's Mythology stubbornly remained on her night table for a long time, leaving Sophie to eventually ask Vivian why she only ever read the one book. "I must be the world's slowest reader," admitted Vivian, wondering if she would ever have the courage to actually pick it up and read it. Initially, Sophie asked about Gregory a lot, and even played imaginary games with him, leaving Vivian struggling to hide her tears. "He has moved away," she would tell Sophie. "He does not live here now?" Sophie would ask over and over again, with her small child's repetitiveness. "I want him to visit us again." "I do not know where he lives, but it is his heart that has moved away," Vivian said at last. Sophie frowned. "I hope he moved with it," she said firmly, with the literal logic of childhood. Sophie did not understand at all. That much was clear. But this explanation gave Vivian some relief to at last have found a good description of things. To admit he went because I accused him of murder and then all but threw him out, or even something similar, to this wide-eyed child who had loved him, was too god-awful to contemplate. Then, another time, Sophie took down his picture in its small frame that was on the top of her bookshelf, the picture that they had taken together at the photo booth at Penn Station, where Gregory's face shone with a rare and brilliant smile as Sophie beamed beside him, and she asked uncertainly, "Was he my father?" "I will die from the pain in this moment," thought Vivian, her head spinning as if someone had socked her in the jaw. "Sometimes it seems as if we had hardly spent very much time together, so when did our lives become so intertwined?" "No, he was not your father. He was just a very good friend," Vivian finally managed to say, tears sliding down her face. And then the two of them found themselves sitting on the floor of Sophie's bedroom, where they shared a bag of gummy candies that Sophie had found behind her books, and they both cried and held each other as they ate them. "What a sorry mess we are," Vivian thought. "My already small family, smaller now once more by one, because I thought I could not live with his supposed truths. I never even gave him a chance to speak to me about it, or try to explain, I deserve everything I have reaped. She took Gregory's picture away, but Sophie stubbornly demanded to have it put back, and it was not for a long time after that she stopped mentioning him, and that Vivian was at last able to take the picture out of its frame and put it away for good. Yes, Vivian had not been all that happy with her life when Gregory had found her in Central Park that fateful day, but that was nothing compared to her misery after her return from their ill-fated trip south. Inside of her, it was as if someone had lit a match and set ablaze all of the despair that she had once pushed down and hidden inside of herself. There was no hiding it now. Her world heaved and distorted, trying to absorb the aftershocks of Gregory's disappearance from her life. As close as they had become, and now that Vivian was aware of how extremely connected they were, there was no way to contemplate the loss of it all without seeing it as a kind of death. Here had been something irreplaceable, she kept telling herself, and I broke it. I sent him away. I accused him of something he hadn't even done. He trusted me, and I failed him. For the first time, she really thought about what he must have lived through when she had left him back in New Orleans. Suffering like this was second nature to him now, though, wasn't it? Well, she would just have to get good at it, too. Every morning, she would wake up, slip the yoke of misery around her neck, and move through her days. Feeling pain became how she knew that she was still alive after nights of tossing and turning before falling into a death-like slumber. Vivian was no stranger, of course, to personal hurt. At one point in her life, she had spent a good deal of her time with Gregory by sobbing on the front of his suit. She had never cried with anyone as much as she had cried in his presence, a horrible thought, since Vivian disliked over-emotionality and weakness. But after her return from New Orleans, it was suddenly impossible anymore to hold herself to not letting her despair be visible to anyone. Tears threatened to spill at any minor annoyance or sad thought. At work, to somehow make it through the workday without constantly losing her composure, she became gruff and curt with others, so that none of her colleagues wanted to have lunch with her anymore or interact with her much at all, unless it was absolutely necessary. Some dim-brained manager mistakenly thought her behavior was a sign that she was unusually serious about the job, so she was promoted, at last, to claims specialist. Vivian didn't even celebrate. In the letter informing her of her promotion, her supervisor noted her always cheerful attitude at work, leaving Vivian to wonder whether he was really that oblivious, or if she had perhaps been that convincing with him, despite the reality that she was all but disintegrating on the inside. She finally decided that it was easier to fool people than she had previously thought. At about the same time, she received a letter from a law firm in Manhattan telling her that her bills would continue to be paid in perpetuity for as long as she lived in the apartment, or for as long as she wished. She wondered if she could continue to accept Gregory's charity under the circumstances, thought that she shouldn't. But then she filed the letter away and tried not to think of it anymore. It was too unpleasant. If anything, this is a benefit that offsets my having to stay here, ensconced in misery, she thought, realizing as she thought it, what a selfish thought it was. Is this part of what Gregory once spoke of, that seesaw of self-will and despair? She wondered. And what about Gregory? The dawning realization of the possible true nature of things with him began to tumble about incessantly in her mind. His secrets, the truths he was keeping from her. It was not only that, though, was it? As Mr. Gerstner had said, there were some truths that he even hid from himself, because they hurt too much to confront directly. Vivian now thought that she finally even understood the deep, anguished, selfless impulse behind his initial warped marriage proposal, which had so shocked her younger self when he had offered to let her take lovers. It had not been a nudity, but rather something desperate and infinitely sad, and she had not understood, and he knew that she would not, and now she thought she did understand. But it was all over. How could he know that he could not have children? She wondered at the time. Now she knew. Children were a part of the normal cycle of life, a cycle that Gregory had left behind years ago. Her most profound realization, however, was that he had held back from telling Vivian anything, had intentionally drawn out the time before sharing much about himself, because he knew that once he told her, their time together would be that much closer to being over. In great love, he withheld these things from me so that we could lengthen the brief time of happiness we would ever have together, she said to herself. And I was a fool and pushed him for more and more disclosures, and then I jumped to the kinds of conclusions that ripped us apart. Well, she had gotten her wish, and had at last gotten to know Gregory a little bit better. But what had she even actually learned? What were the right conclusions to draw from it all? In the bombed-out horror of her final moments with him, and then immediately after the dreadful conversation that she had had with Mr. Gerstner, her mind was so badly shaken that she wasn't even sure anymore what was real. What had she in fact discovered about Gregory? What was true, and what could not possibly be true? Was he a monster? He was ready to die in New Orleans rather than hurt her. That he had come very close to proving. But his strange habits concerning blood and food, and what about his work on the Red Cross flights in the war? That work had helped a great many people. Did that make it all right if some of the donations did not reach their intended destination? In war, if not at other times, do the ends justify the means? And if they did, do I want this as a part of me? She wondered. Do I have a choice? Am I partly responsible for what he does, for the way that he lives? But then again, what if I have misunderstood everything? What if this is not at all how he lives? In this way, she intensely spent the first few weeks trying to figure it all out. Then, one day, she realized that she did not give a damn how it all worked, or whether he was a demon from a scary story instead of a man. It was minor, unimportant, and irrelevant. It just did not matter. All that she knew for certain was that she wanted him back. But if he is what I think he is, she wondered sometimes, could he make me one such as himself? What would that be like? How would that be accomplished? Oh, how idiotic of you, Vivian, she then told herself. Surely if this was an option he would have mentioned it. And who would even want something like that anyways? Look at the unhappiness that it has brought him. And what about Sophie and the entire rest of life as it is? The key point was that she was not absolutely sure how things really stood. His dubious way of living his open-ended statements about his reality, the things that Mr. Gerstner had said. Mr. Gerstner had told her something about Gregory's habits and his personality, and he had not denied Vivian's superstitious theory, but he did make it seem less monstrous. He had even seemed to say that the less one took, the more often one would have to go out, paradoxically creating the impression of more evil rather than less. He had also not denied other awful things, about injuring people and killing others. She had been so upset at the time that much of their dialogue had been overwritten in her memory with plain, blind wrath. And now, of course, there was no going by the store to ask him to explain himself. "I'm fortunate to be rid of so potentially dangerous a creature," she thought sometimes. And then at other times she would sob into her pillow that none of it mattered, and that she would have him back, no matter what he did at night, even if it was crawl out of a crypt and prey upon the unsuspecting living. The love in her own heart had become a ravenous and destructive beast, clawing at itself and at anyone who attempted to come close. Why, it would have made a perfect companion to a violent, unnatural creature of the shadows. "I threw you out in my last moments of pseudo-holiness," she thought cynically. "I thought I was too good for you. Well, you should come back and see me now. I'm not so proud anymore. I would willingly be the bride of the devil if only it would let me get you back. You signed that marriage contract in blood, am I right? Oh, what is the use? I cannot condemn you, Gregory," she thought. "Someone else might be able to do so, but I cannot condemn you. I love you too much." She spent the next few months thinking about how she might get him back, but the guilt from the knowledge that she was the one who had sent him away prevented her from taking any action at all. She was afraid and ashamed and miserable. She sank deeper into the pain. Vivian knew she could not entirely indulge herself in this sadness in the way that it wanted to take her, because she had her mother and Sophie to look after, and she had her job to go to. So she struggled along and tried to keep her head above water. But when the day ended and everyone went to bed, the grief rose up and took over, and in this emotionally unstable and confusing time, she often spent the nights crying in her bed in the dark, occasionally calling upon him to be with her, and at times cursing his name and wishing that she had never met him. Then she would fall asleep and sometimes dream of him, of his arms about her, holding her against him as when she had been sick, of dancing with him through her living room, of their deepest kisses, and of the night that she had had with him. Once only, one single night, never to be repeated. The memory of that would send her pulse to racing, her heart to constricting in agony, and her eyes to overflowing with tears again. She had done all that she could. Was it not his fault that they could not be together? Conflicted emotional knots, such as, "I hate you, my love," suddenly sprang up readily to mind, and at times she would catch herself having such thoughts and think she must be going crazy and that she should be ashamed of herself. But there was simply no stuffing the emotions in like she had done before. There was too much feeling now to fit all inside her small person. When the emotional storm subsided, she would lie awake in the dark, clutching at her pillow like a shipwreck survivor might cling to a floating log, and she would start thinking all over again. Everything had gone so fast in those last few months with him, and how strange it had all been. Supernatural creatures did not exist. Everyone knew that. Yet here was Gregory Morgan, who most certainly did exist, living a lifespan that should not have been possible, and never changing in his appearance. Could the rest of the legends and scary stories also be true? In New Orleans, and especially after meeting his friend with the yo-yo, everything had seemed very real and very clear in her mind, but now she could not be certain of anything anymore. What had Gregory said to her about these things? She could not remember. The only thing she could hear over and over was him lying in bed beside her and telling her that he loved her. And then she was standing by the window screaming as he jumped out of it and vanished, just like Psyche's Eros. In her nightmares, sometimes Vivian would dream of Gregory again in the last moments that she had ever had with him, and he was saying to her, "Oh, Psyche, why didn't you trust me? Don't you know that there can be no love without trust?" And then in her dream, Vivian would see Gregory unfurling large, dark gray wings with bat-like talons at the ends of them and leaping out of the window and into the dark of the night. Psyche had pleaded with Eros to return, as Vivian had pleaded in vain with Mr. Gerstner. And then what was to come next? Nothing but a long series of superhuman trials and miseries awaited Psyche after Eros was gone, Vivian recalled. That must be what I'm living through now, and there's no way out. Oh, I have learned my lesson, she thought. Even the harshness of the daily events of life is nothing compared to the raw power of abandonment and heartbreak as a teaching tool. This grief has vanquished me in a way that being poor and struggling never did. I'm getting to know a bit about that dark place that Gregory once spoke of, and if I'm not careful, I will end up as its permanent resident. This is what he spoke of, this horrible inner loneliness and misery, and how ironic that, now that we have separated, I finally understand him so completely. After about 3 or 4 months after her return from New Orleans, she finally started to firm up and solidify around her new core, like a volcano after a destructive eruption. Once more, like the small child who had cried and cried but no one had come, Vivian found that what she had just lived through had hardened her heart, making her more unreachable, but thankfully also making her stronger and more stable. She felt a small flush of returning inner confidence and got herself to not only write, but also to finally mail a letter to Gregory, care of Mr. Gerstner's store. But there was no reply. Another month or so later, she finally pulled together the courage to visit Mr. Gerstner again, but he was not there, and the store was shut. Vivian was glad, because she was still angry with him, but then she realized that he was her only path to Gregory, and suddenly she felt very conflicted and foolish, and went home and told herself that if Gregory did not write back, she should take it as a sign to leave it all alone. Over a year passed before she found herself near the book repair shop again, and, unable to resist, she walked in. Mr. Gerstner, his unchanging bushy eyebrows and white hair and wrinkled face, looking over at her with an expression of immense surprise across his features, told her that Gregory had been in town a few months earlier, but now had moved away from New York for good. It had been a stunning blow. "Oh, did he say anything about me?" Vivian stammered, her heart hammering so loud that she thought she might not even be able to be heard over its pounding. "Not to me, Frau Vivian," Mr. Gerstner had told her. That reply had made her flee the shop in tears. It was over. Well, of course it was over. It had been over about 1.5 years ago now. If Gregory wanted to write to her, or to visit her again, it was not as if he could not find the address this time. He himself had bought the goddamn apartment. "He simply doesn't want me," she told herself. "There. Now we all know how it really is. I made an unforgivable mistake, and now I have to live with the consequences. This is how our lives go. Out of phase, out of touch, out of hope, out of trust, out of time. When will I just take this half-empty glass and accept it? When will I just lay down and die and accept the crushed-up misery of all things?" She didn't realize it, but it was probably one of the most deeply felt emotions that she had ever tried to put into words. And for someone who mistrusted strong emotion, it was disorienting, as if coming from an unfamiliar and distorted self, from a warped reflection in a funhouse mirror. Who was this Vivian who felt these things and who could not accept reality? Was it truly herself? Just after he had gone, she had found his bottle of bourbon whiskey, standing in its usual place behind the living room curtains by the console table, and at first she had clutched it to her chest like it was a beloved infant, and she wept hysterically. Then she drank a solid 1/5 of it straight from the bottle, and had no recollection of anything after that, until she woke up in the dark, fully dressed and sprawled across her bed, her mouth like sandpaper, and the contents of her stomach already climbing up her throat. She put the bottle away in her bedroom after that, and told herself she would only drink from it in small amounts now, on the anniversary of their New Orleans trip. Now, on this 4th anniversary, she eyed the bottle skeptically, and realized that if she lived another 50 years without him, its remaining contents would never last her. She told herself that she would drink some perhaps next year, and then after that she would put the bottle away, and hope that he returned again, before its remaining liquid entirely evaporated. She also began writing him a short letter each year, but, having nowhere to send it, she just folded it up and put it in the box that she had with all of her other small mementos of him. At Christmas time, she always wrote him a greeting, which she then set a match to and burned. Once a year, she left Sophie with her mother and took a trip alone back to Lake Warramog, where she walked the lake's perimeter and then sat on its edge and tried to remember everything that Gregory had ever said and everything that they had ever done together. "Vivian, when did you become so melodramatic?" she could hear Mr. Gerstner's voice saying. "Tisk, tisk, too much Cyrano." Go away, she thought. All of you, go away. No one ever really understood how much he meant. The only person who understood was Nadine. They cried together over the telephone, and Vivian found herself both wanting to share everything and having to cautiously edit out anything that she had learned about Gregory's strange life. "I just don't know how to get him out of my heart, how to forget him and move on," admitted Vivian. "There is no getting him out of your heart. He is part of your heart. Just leave that part of your heart alone and accept that this is how it is. Oh, Vivian, do you know for how many years now you have loved him? You have known him even longer than I have known Frank, and I cannot imagine that anyone could ever tear Frank out of my heart. The connection goes on, in some other way perhaps, but it doesn't break. Don't wish that it would. Don't wish for anything about it at all. Just leave it the way that it is. Should I come up there and see you, to make sure that you will hold together? Asked Nadine. No need for that. I will be fine. Also, things are very busy right now, said Vivian quickly. She did not want anyone to see how miserable she was, least of all someone who knew her so well that she could see right through Vivian's facade of stability. And I know you have so much going on with Frankie Jr. and with deciding whether you should move across town and where to send him for first grade. Vivian gulped down her tears and added, Thank you so much for your kind words and for understanding. You are the only one who does. Oh, if I could do something to make you happier, I would very much want to do it. Let me know how I can be the best possible friend to you right now, said Nadine. And then the holding back of tears became hopeless, and they both cried together. Vivian assured Nadine that nothing was needed, but then a few weeks later, Nadine sent a package full of somewhat crumbled baked goods, a box of pralines, postcards of New Orleans, a can of chicory coffee from the Café du Monde, and a letter that Vivian kept on her night table and reread over and over again for its warmth and consolation. It made her feel that she was not all alone in the universe, as she often felt now. Gregory's departure from their world had left matters further strained between Vivian and her mother. At first, her mother had asked many questions, trying to find out what had happened between them this time, and she was offended to be rebuffed. Then she told Vivian that it was good riddance that he had gone. Vivian turned on her. How dare you, Mother? You of all people! You liked him while he was a wealthy prospective husband for me, and then you no longer liked him, and then you liked him again, switching as was convenient for you. Her mother stood up, straightening her aging spine to as tall as she was able. I have nothing that I am ashamed of in this, she said. I reacted to new information. When it becomes clear that a man is not in any way suitable for marriage, then one moves on and cuts ties. What would be the purpose of keeping any such relationship alive, filling perhaps both sides with false hopes? You have known for some time that he was unsuitable. That was why you married another. Well, it turns out that he was also unsuitable, even as an acquaintance, and now you have your just deserts. Vivian stormed out of the room, shocked that the one person closest to her could so completely fail to see things as they had been. It was clear that no one understood at all. Her mother realized that she had overstepped some unspoken boundary, and shortly her response shifted. She was clearly relieved that Gregory was gone, and she tried to rally Vivian by saying daft things like, Why do you just sit here like that and mope? He left. So what? You would throw your whole life away over this man. But this soon faded, too, as she saw the deep grief with which Vivian took his going. It was as if her mother had never believed that Vivian had truly loved Gregory, or at least she had not guessed at the depths of feeling there, until the tearing up of this tree exposed its deep roots. Her mother then switched to saying things like, There, it was probably for the best, which made Vivian want to scream. Go away. There's no reaching me right now, Vivian thought as her mother alternated between trying to pry forth information and trying to get Vivian to look on the bright side. A part of me has just died, thought Vivian. What bright side could there possibly be to that? Then, at about the same time that Vivian returned to Mr. Gerstner's store, only to discover that Gregory had moved away, her mother began pushing Vivian to go out and try to meet other men. It has been long enough that you have grieved over this man, her mother said. You are not so young anymore, you know, Vivian. You have to think of yourself and of Sophie. Do you really want the kind of life that I had, living alone with you and struggling to make ends meet? You deserve better, and better involves being with a man and living in a more stable and settled kind of way. I'm thinking of your own good, Vivian, and besides the practical concerns, I'm also thinking of your heart. You are a good daughter and a kind-hearted woman. Don't you want to have someone to love you? Someone that you could love back? Vivian held firm against any such idea. Her heart was frozen and buried, as if under an avalanche of snow. What is left of my heart that I could even love someone with? She asked herself. Then she began thinking whether she was being selfish about it all, given that Sophie was being raised without a father, just like Vivian herself had been. Perhaps her mother was right. When would this sad tradition stop in their family? In another half a year, a new younger male colleague at work asked Vivian out to lunch, then out to dinner. Vivian went, but lethargically. There was no point in any of it, but at least it might help get her mother off her back for trying, and practically, she'd get a meal out of it. The young man seemed genuinely interested in Vivian. "You are always so elegant, Miss Vivian," he told her. "You carry yourself like a queen. I can see that you come from a fine background. Who are your people in the South, Miss Vivian?" "You know nothing about me," thought Vivian. "My people are a horse thief of a father whom I never knew, and a mother who was so poor that we spent most of my childhood sharing a single breakfast egg. I never knew anything refined and cultured until Gregory Morgan showed up in our world." The young man was rather charming and nice, but as he was contemplating family and marriage for the first time, he was far less interested to learn, after 2 or 3 dinners together, that Vivian had a small child at home from a previous marriage. The speed with which his visits to her desk ceased was downright shocking, and the whole experience felt like a slap in the face. A few weeks later, she saw him walking out the door at lunchtime with another of her younger female co-workers. Well, I didn't want him anyways, so good riddance, Vivian thought. There hadn't been a lot of young men since then, and in the few lunches that there had been, she rapidly discovered that these were married men looking for an unattached young girl to have an affair with. They might not mind that I have a young child, Vivian thought. If only I wouldn't mind being a married man's plaything for a while, then it might yet work out. How much money would I do this for? What is my price? A mink coat? Just a small mink stole? Diamond earrings? A couple $100? The mere thought made her feel diseased and stained. You spoiled me for anyone else, Gregory Morgan, she thought bitterly. Who else could there now be that could even try to hold a candle to you? When we had kissed for the first time, I had not realized that this was going to be the other side of that coin, that the price was that I could never again be happy with anyone else. Now take that nice young man who moved in just downstairs. He helped me with the groceries the other day. He does not wear a wedding band, so perhaps, said her mother. I know that Gregory meant a lot to you, but you have to let this go. This went on and on like this, with the delivery men, the sales clerks at the store, and anyone else who entered their vicinity and appeared to be an unmarried man. Vivian cringed inwardly every time. May I ask you for 2 things, Mother? Vivian finally asked. One is, if I might have the bracelet that Gregory made for you once, so long ago. The other is, if we could please never mention his name between us again. Her mother had set down her sewing, given Vivian a long, tired look, and then she had stood up and gone off into her bedroom. A few minutes later, she returned with a bracelet of purple stones that Gregory had given her that early Christmas so many years ago. "Here, you may have it," her mother said. "I see how much unhappiness he has brought you, and I wish we had never heard of him. He wormed his way into our family. I don't even know how. He never explained why he would not settle down, and then he left us again in a shambles. I am bitter with him because of you, because I am your mother and love you and wanted the best for you, and you deserved better than you got from that man. I'm satisfied also to never have his name fall in this house again." There are shades of Mr. Gerstner here, thought Vivian. He holds a similar grudge against me for making Gregory so unhappy. Oh, no one understands how it all was, how we were to each other, and what it all meant, and I cannot explain. From that moment on, Vivian and her mother held to their new arrangement, and Gregory became the unmentioned presence lurking on the periphery of their lives. And now here Vivian was, 4 years into it, on yet another sad autumn anniversary, sobbing onto her kitchen table quietly into the silence of the evening. She took one more pour from the bottle and drank it down with a cough, and then she stood up and put the bourbon bottle away for good. If she drank enough, she could see him out of the corner of her eye, she discovered. And if she had just a little bit more, she could even hear his voice, low and passionate in her ear, his words like caressing fingertips against the back of her neck, where she could feel everything, but yet not see him. He had to return. At some point, he had to return. 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years now. Oh, but his superhuman timescales were entirely different from hers, she realized again with despair. How long the 10 years without him had been before he had showed back up in her world. And it could be much longer than just 10 years. He could come back in 50 years unchanged, and it would be akin to perhaps 5 years to her in her life experience. When she really wanted to give herself nightmares, she would imagine him stunningly beautiful and full of the vigor of youth, while she turned into a grandmother with a bun on top of her head, looking perhaps like Nadine's grandmother before she had died. If she wasn't crying already, that thought always took her straight to tears. If there were worse things than this, suddenly Vivian could not think of any of them. How awful such an experience would be. And this was the only possibility still ahead of them, wasn't it? Every possibly good outcome was now behind them, back in the unreachable past. Winter was always awful, but now it seemed even worse. The holiday times were difficult, as they always were, for heartbroken people. The December after the 4-year anniversary of his leaving was particularly hard, as there came the added blight of the death of Bunny Beauregard. "Tell me again the story about the man who gave me the bunny, Mother," begged Sophie, sitting at the kitchen table and wiping at her tears with a napkin. "Well, you know," began Vivian evasively. "He was a family friend. His name was Mr. Morgan. Gregory Morgan." "Oh," said Sophie. It was very similar in feel to the conversations that they had had about Chip, when Sophie had asked to hear about her father. Vivian assured her that he was handsome and witty, but that he had had to return to his family in Great Britain. Sophie wanted to know if they would ever go over to visit, and Vivian vaguely said they might. For a while it was a topic that came up often, but then it faded. "I had a fictional father that I dreamed about," remembered Vivian. "But then Gregory came into my life, and everything else just swept away and vanished." Now that she had turned 9 years old a few weeks earlier, Sophie was beginning to look and to reason like a fully functioning human, but she was as headstrong as ever. "She gets that from her father," thought Vivian, never deigning to consider that Sophie might just as easily have gotten it from Vivian herself. Although Sophie was quite sharp-witted, she thought very little of school. Vivian tried to explain to Sophie what a privilege it was to be able to go to school at all, but Sophie said schooling did not matter much, since she was planning to make a brilliant marriage. Vivian raised her eyebrow. It was obvious Sophie had been fed this idea from someone else. "I will have to speak to my mother about this," Vivian thought grimly. "This is not the days of Teddy Roosevelt anymore. What girl can just hang her hat on making a brilliant marriage?" To Sophie, Vivian just suggested that a husband might want a wife who was smart and had her wits about her, to which Sophie accurately replied that having wits and working hard at school were not the same thing. Vivian sighed. "If I have these kinds of difficulties with her now, at the age of 9, what awaits me in a few more years' time?" Vivian, her mother, and Sophie spent the last days of the calendar year helping Edith, her husband, and little Robert move out of their apartment, their assistance consisting mainly of having Robert over to play for hours on end, while Edith and her hardly-ever-home husband packed up the entire household. So many people had come and gone over the years. How much longer will we end up living here? Vivian wondered. Angela had moved away to Pennsylvania years ago with her ex-Army major, and Vivian had been so busy with her life and her job that she had not had much time to meet the new neighbors, so her social world simply shrank even further, leaving her own mother firmly anchored in the center of Vivian's world. Edith's Robert had predictably grown into a quiet, shy boy who spent the first hour of each visit cautiously and atypically sitting on the sofa, and then eventually he would warm up to playing some kind of game. Sophie did not run around and tear on Robert's hair any more, of course, but all the games that she suggested they play were along the lines of Duchess and Footman, or card games, where she always beat him and then crowed over it. Robert just sat wide-eyed across from her at the kitchen table and stared helplessly, and Vivian could tell that Sophie's golden-haired beauty left him dazed. Had they stayed a few years longer, who knew where this might have led? Probably nowhere good, from little Robert's perspective. But he had been a playmate for Sophie for all of these years, and that was something to be grateful for. Now, of course, Sophie's friends were girls from her school, a girl named Nancy and 2 or 3 others who lived within easy walking distance, and without Sophie having to cross any major streets alone. They giggled about boys and told each other how disgusting boys were, Vivian knew. Well, just wait a few more years, she thought. In the evenings, Vivian was often downstairs with her mother to help her with her sewing projects. Or on other evenings, her mother came up to their apartment. Vivian and her mother talked mostly about Sophie and her future. Talk of Vivian's own future had at last ceased, to Vivian's relief. Vivian's mother complained more and more frequently of her eyes, and she began to take on fewer sewing projects. Very delicate decorative needlework she no longer wanted to undertake at all. Time is passing, thought Vivian. Everything changes, and we just move with it, carried as if by a raging river of time. Then in January, Sophie had come home after a visit at a classmate's home and had told her mother how handsome all of the mothers agreed that Gregory was. His name fell like this, casually, into the quiet of the kitchen, and Vivian had not even been able to breathe. Gregory? Oh, what does this have to do with Gregory? She had finally managed to ask, trying to ignore the sensation of cold water oozing down the back of her neck. It was one thing to think of him secretly and theoretically, but it was quite another to imagine that he would really just pop up unexpectedly again in her life. Sophie sat at the table, spearing her dinner half-heartedly onto the end of her fork, and twirling a long and wavy lock of her stunning blonde hair around a finger with her other, elbow undaintily on the tabletop. You know, Gregory Peck. He is an actor, and he has a new movie with Audrey Hepburn in which she plays a princess and he plays a reporter. Faye told me her mother had actually taken her to see it. She said he was dreamy. Gregory Peck. Oh, God, I'm an idiot, thought Vivian, trying to bring her erratic heartbeat back to normal. That this reaction still came over her, although years and years had passed, made her loathe herself. At age 9, I'd think Faye would be a bit too young to go see movies with dreamy actors in them, and her mother should know better, muttered Vivian. Still, she then left Sophie with her mother for an evening in the next week and went to see the movie for herself. Gregory Peck was debonair and dreamy, exactly as advertised, but trying at all to compare Gregory Peck in the film Roman Holiday with Gregory Morgan was an exercise in futility. The silver screen had never had anything to offer that could even approach Gregory Morgan's resplendence and fineness as a person, Vivian thought loyally. And then with her next thought, she wondered if that was in part why he had never returned, that he had sobered up when he had gone away, and he had realized how painfully average and unimpressive she actually was in comparison to him. From there, the next thought after that was that no matter what he had thought of her, she was the one who had thrown him out, and that was the thought that always set ablaze all over again her now mostly dormant misery. It was as if she could feel so much better and stronger after all of this time, in many weeks, hardly thinking of him at all, and then a sudden small thing would set her off, and she would get caught right in the same emotional whirlpool that she had been in when he left, and it never seemed to hurt any less. Is there wisdom beyond this? She wondered. Is there a point past which it no longer hurts? Where is that point, and how will I know when I have reached it? Will I ever reach it? Or who knows, perhaps this suppressed, dormant ache is as good as it is ever going to get for the rest of my days. Even after all this time, Vivian still spent her days in a quiet fog of solitude, and combined with her poor distance vision, it kept her in a protected shell while moving about through the world. She had become used to this feeling, and it was jarring to her in this state when anyone suddenly intruded into her full awareness. One day, she was crossing the street, holding a hand to her hair to keep it from blowing in the wind, when she heard, "Miss Westcott! Miss Westcott!" from behind her on the sidewalk. A man was pushing his way toward her, a man she could not recognize. To her eyes, he was rather blurred around the edges, but his voice seemed familiar. She paused to let him catch up to her. He stopped just short of her and doffed his older gentleman's hat. "Miss Westcott, it's me, Ogden Carlyle." His face was full of far more wrinkles than she remembered, but it was him. "Oh, Mr. Carlyle, what a pleasant surprise!" exclaimed Vivian. "Do you have a new office near here, or what brings you to this part of town?" "New office? My dear, I have been a retired gentleman now for many years. I am in town to meet with my lawyer. Now that Mrs. Carlyle has passed, I am making some changes to my will," said Mr. Carlyle. "Oh, I'm sorry to hear it. My sympathies on your loss," said Vivian quietly. "Well, we all eventually reach that age when we need to make preparations, or revise our preparations, for the time when we will no longer need to worry ourselves with our world affairs. But tell me about yourself. You went to work for a large company when you left me, if I remember right," asked Mr. Carlyle, moving over to the side of the sidewalk so that other passers-by could continue on unimpeded. "Yes, I took a job with the Manhattan National Life Insurance Company, and I have remained there all these years. Business has been good," Vivian told him, feeling a twinge of guilt still after all of these years for having left the Carlyle Addressing Machine Company after Mr. Carlyle had been so kind to her. "Oh, very good, very good. And marriage? Children? A happy home?" he asked her, his voice friendly and warm. "They always ask eventually," sighed Vivian. "No, I have not married Mr. Carlyle," she told him honestly. "What's this? You look even more beautiful than when you worked for me, and you were always quick-witted and hard-working and efficient. What is it that young men could be looking for these days in a wife, if not someone with your qualities?" Mr. Carlyle seemed genuinely surprised. "I have no idea what young men are looking for these days," thought Vivian numbly. "You are very kind, Mr. Carlyle," she said out loud. "I am flattered. As you may not know, I was married when I was very young, and I lost my husband in the war. My daughter is now 9 years old. Keeping up with her keeps me quite busy." Mr. Carlyle looked even more surprised. "I had no idea you had a daughter, or that you had lost your husband." "I made it a point not to tell anyone," said Vivian. "That was also why I left the position with you when I did. As the sole supporter of a small child, I did not think I had the option to wait for the uncertainties surrounding your company to become resolved." Mr. Carlyle nodded. "Well, that certainly makes sense. I confess it pained me when you left so quickly, but then you turned out to be right, and we were unable to save the company. You look like you have done well for yourself since, not like when you were the girl who worked for me and only had 1 or 2 suits of dress to her name." Vivian smiled. "It's true. I suppose it is a blessing that I do not think about on most days, but I have a whole wardrobe full of clothing now, and handbags to match. We are comfortably set up." "Oh, I'm very glad to hear it. You deserve it. You were the best secretary that I ever had, Miss Westcott, and I am sure that your present employer is also eminently aware of your high value. Hold your chin high. They don't even make 'em like you anymore." Mr. Carlyle gave her a broad smile. "Well, I don't want to delay you further, because I'm sure you are hurrying somewhere, but I'm very glad to see you and to hear that you are doing well. Here, let me give you my address, in case you ever need anything and I can be of service. Oh dear, it appears that I'm out of cards. Well, here, I will write it out for you on the back of this one. It is the card of my local solicitor in Connecticut. Here, now, to find a pen. Yes, well, now take this in any case, so that you know where to find me if you ever need anything. I live out in Greenwich now. Vivian took the card, shook the hand that he extended, and thanked him and waved goodbye. Inside, her entire rib cage felt like it would crumble to pieces at his kind words. To hear unexpected praise like this was so rare in her world, and her long unhappiness had made her so hesitating and so self-uncertain that she could almost not bear to hear it, could not bear the kindness of it. She turned her face back into the wind, dabbed a sleeve at her eyes, and kept walking. Time passed again. The seasons moved fluidly past, one melting into the next, as months turned into years. And Vivian had turned 35, then 36, then 37, then 38. She said goodbye to her own hair color and started to have it dyed a shade of darker blonde at the neighborhood hairdresser's. No need to look old, although she certainly was getting older. In her youth, the secrets she had kept from her work colleagues involved her humble background, her failed marriage, and the existence of Sophie. Now, she kept secrets about her age. Over this time, she had 2 relationships that looked like they might go beyond dinner dates and dancing to Frank Sinatra, to something further, but her heart just wasn't in it. No one spoke to her like Gregory had. No one touched her like that. No one set her world on fire or made her tremble with his fingertips. She knew she should not try to compare, but then could not stop herself from doing so. Eventually, she gave up trying to forget Gregory, and instead started to wonder if he would, at long last, reappear. By 1958, Vivian was waiting for Gregory, like one might wait for a returning comet. He seemed to collide with her life, practically literally, every 10 years or so, did he not? Well, it was 10 years again now. But there was nothing. No sign of him. By now, it was not the return of an actual man or lover that Vivian envisioned, but the return of a divine being. Someone so perfect and with a halo sketched in by the hand of time that it was no longer possible to relate to this being on any normal human level. She stood at the window and looked at the gathering winter clouds in the sky, and wondered how it would be if he reappeared at her doorstep, all youthful and smiling, and ready to give benediction to all mortals. The idea of him in theory like this was sweet and delicious, and miles removed from the uncertain, mysterious being that she had learned about a decade ago. You remember what you want to remember, she half realized, but she did not let it bother her. A kind of optimism was stirring within, and she was content to settle into it. Sophie was older now and thriving. Vivian's job at the insurance company was more secure than ever, and things were actually going rather well. Even the memory of Gregory had softened over the years to where it was almost a happy one, albeit in a bittersweet kind of way. At this time, she also met a man who stood out among her potential suitors. His name was William Wainwright, and he was new to the insurance company, but did not work directly with Vivian, who had, after all these years, moved into the training department. He was older. He was handsome. He was what she supposed would be called genteel, and he was a childless widower. He spoke of his late wife in a way that made her passing seem a fresh occurrence rather than 7 years ago now. And from the way that he spoke of her, it was clear that she had been the love of his life, and no one else could ever hope to compare. To most women, this would probably be a detriment in a love interest, but to Vivian, it was a strong selling point in his favor. If his heart had been irreversibly stamped with the image of another person, then he might be more tolerant of Vivian's heart being the same way. She told him that she had lost her husband, glibly fusing Chip and Gregory into one great past love, and he nodded and said that he felt the same way, and this was something that they had in common. He was from an old Maryland family and read books for entertainment, which reminded her of Gregory. He also took her to concerts and operas and ballets, where Vivian half shamefully reveled in being able to linger in old memories once the lights dimmed. They had recently begun having dinner together once a week or so, and it was always pleasant to spend time with someone as polite and attentive as William Wainwright was. "I've been dying of loneliness," Vivian suddenly realized. It had been so long, she had almost been able to convince herself that she no longer needed anyone. But now it was suddenly very pleasant to have someone to spend time with. William always told her that she looked lovely, asked her about what was new in the training department, and then spoke to her about what was new in his department and what books he had read, or radio broadcasts or television programs he had heard or seen. Human interaction can be a very nice thing, Vivian had to admit to herself. On their last outing, William had suggested a weekend trip by boat to see the historic estates that lined the coast of Newport up in Rhode Island. He had given her a brochure from the boating business, which now rested on her night table, and which she had begun to half-heartedly consider. A future with William Wainwright was likely going to be more pleasant than a future entirely by herself, but she had her life with her daughter and her mother all established now, and she would be risking the stability of the status quo if she made any sudden changes. It was not obvious what she should do. She spoke with Nadine at length on the telephone about twice a year these days, and she asked her friend for advice. Nadine, the romantic believer, urged her to give a future with William Wainwright a fair chance, but all of Vivian's pain and heartbreak had made her even more risk-averse than she already was by nature, and it was difficult to consider taking any plunge. Now that Vivian felt better in her heart about all of her past hurts with Gregory, and she did not realize it, but these hurts had completely wiped out her remaining disappointment and pain over Chip, whom she thought of maybe once or twice a year now. She thought she could indulge herself her memories of Gregory in a way that she had not been able to do in the early years after he had gone. In one of the drawers in her bedroom, Vivian had an empty box of fine French chocolates which she had once received and since filled with all of her old mementos of Gregory. She had not dared to look into it very much, because it would always make her cry uncontrollably at first. But now, so many years later, she thought she felt strong enough to sit down with it and to pull out each item one by one and to see what memories it brought up. There was his book of mythology, which she had put away at last. There was an envelope filled with the crumbling, vanishing dust of flower petals that she had once pulled out of the trash back in their old apartment in Milnberg. There were white gloves and the tiara from their long-ago historic costume ball, a few holiday greetings and letters tied together with ribbons from various bouquets that Gregory had given her, a matchbox from Galatoire's, the playbill from the time they had gone to see Cyrano, the playbills from the symphony in the Met, and some souvenir books from his European trip. The 5-strand silver and purple necklace that he had given her was there, as was the bracelet that her mother had given her to keep, and a few of his handkerchiefs were there also, with only an illusory and possibly entirely fictitious amount of his cologne still on them. The dried rose from his buttonhole that he had given to her the day that they had agreed to get married rested on top of everything else, and under the letters were the pictures from the photo booth at Penn Station that he had reluctantly agreed to have taken. Vivian picked up each small picture, one by one. There was Gregory holding Sophie. There was Gregory with Vivian. And there were the three of them, their smiles as fresh as if it had just been yesterday, instead of years and years ago. Today, these are just about all I have left of you, she thought. Oh, how long ago all of this was. And to think that Gregory had memories from even much further back than this. Now that she had so much living under her belt, the passage of time was a frightening, irresistible, and fascinating thing to contemplate. What must it be like to him? The dress from Bergdorf Goodman's, which she had received from him, hung in the back of her wardrobe, covered by an old bedsheet with a hole cut in it through which the clothes hanger stuck through, and Vivian had long ago made it clear to Sophie that, on pain of certain punishment, she was not to take this dress for playing dress-up in. Sometimes Vivian lifted up the bedsheet and gazed upon its beautiful sequins, and she would recall how that moment had been, with Gregory kneeling at her feet, touching her through this dress with his hands, and telling her how beautiful she was, and how much he loved her. I was lucky to have that moment with you, Vivian thought. And it was worth it, despite all of the heartache that followed, when I foolishly threw it all away and lost you. She never put the dress on, but sometimes she put on the necklace, the bracelet, the gloves, and the tiara, and gazed at herself in the mirror. I am a sad queen, she thought, the ruler of a half-broken kingdom, sitting atop a throne set askew on a pile of emotional destruction. She was going through this box and its items now, wondering if this was the year that he would reappear, when the telephone rang. She set down the box on top of her bedclothes, reached for her glasses, which she had folded up on the edge of her night table, put them back on, and hurried to the living room to see who it was. It was her mother, asking if she could come right down, that she had shattered a drinking glass in the kitchen and had cut herself on the shards while attempting to sweep them up, and could Vivian come with some of those clever, self-adhering bandages. Vivian grabbed the box of Band-Aids from under her own kitchen sink and ran downstairs. It was after dinner, before she remembered the box of mementos again, and she hurried into her bedroom to put it away, lest Sophie come across it and inquire about its contents. The cardboard box was still there, its lid closed. Had Vivian closed it before she left the room? She must have, since it was closed now. Vivian opened the box and looked inside. Everything appeared to be there, only oddly the pictures lay on top of the other items and not underneath, as they usually were. Well, she had been in a hurry as she left the room earlier, and Vivian could not honestly recall exactly what she had done before running to get the telephone. Just as a precaution, however, Vivian went into Sophie's bedroom to see what Sophie was up to. She found her sitting on the floor with her back propped up against the bed and looking at a book. "Is anything the matter, Mother?" Sophie asked, looking up from her book with her cool, blue eyes. No, nothing is amiss. I just thought to check on you," said Vivian quickly. "I need to be more careful," she thought to herself. The thought of being confronted by Sophie about Gregory Morgan and having to evade 1,000 questions from her on who he had been and what he had been like and why he had mattered so much was a scene that Vivian had no desire to have played out. Although Vivian thought of Gregory quite often, she had not spoken to anyone of him in years and years now, and even the idea of it was horribly unpleasant to her. Spring came. The days became more and more beautiful, and Vivian thought of once more going to Central Park, a place where she had not dared to go for a few years after Gregory left. And then by the time they went back, Sophie's interests had completely changed, and she did not want to play the same games, although the carousel remained popular. Now Vivian was thinking of going alone, as a sort of working woman's tiny weekly vacation, allowing her to briefly get back amongst the leafy greenery and the birds. Instead of her plans of getting into nature, however, a new distraction arose, so that even the plans for this micro-vacation fell through. Her mother's aging apartment had developed plumbing problems, and now it appeared that a part of the wall and possibly the entire bathtub needed to be replaced. Her mother's apartment was rented, so presumably the landlord would be covering the costs, but the hassle of it would undoubtedly be Vivian's to deal with. Vivian rummaged through her night table drawer until she found her old wedding band from Chip, a precaution that she always suspiciously took when dealing with any installers or handymen, and then she ran down to her mother's apartment to meet with the plumber. He investigated, and then gave Vivian the bad news that this would mean the tear-out of the existing tiles and possibly also the bathtub, that he would go and tell the landlord, and that she should expect to see him often in the weeks to come. Vivian was so engrossed in this bothersome new project that she missed two important things at home. One was that her mother began complaining of abdominal pains, something that she had never done before. The other was that Sophie began spending frequent time away from home. Sophie was now 14 years old, so it was not out of the blue, and she did go to visit her friends, but that had been mostly after school on school days, and not as often on Saturdays or Sundays. It was something that Vivian should have kept a closer eye on, but there was only one of Vivian to go round, and so many things demanded her attention that it was not surprising that she did not catch either of these two things early on. "I will try boiled apples," her mother was saying. "Some people do swear by them." Out of the corner of her eye, Vivian saw Sophie moving in her light jacket toward the apartment door. "Where are you going, Sophie?" she asked. Sophie gave a reply that Vivian only half heard and did not at all register, and then she was shutting the door. "Dinner is at 6 tonight. Please be back in time," Vivian called after her. Then she turned back to her mother. "What is this about boiled apples?" "I will try them for my stomach to see if that helps," said Vivian's mother. "Last night I was awake quite some time with the pain." "I'm sorry to hear that, Mother," said Vivian. "Let me know how the boiled apples work. In the meantime, I meant to explain to you about this bathroom project. They're going to be tiling, and that means you will have to come up and use our bathroom for a few weeks. I'm thinking that it might just be easier if you move up here with us for a bit. What do you think?" They weighed the pros and cons of that over some sewing work, and then Vivian and her mother went into the kitchen to get dinner ready. Sophie raced in, breathless, at the stroke of 6. "Have you been running the entire way back?" Vivian asked her. "Remind me again where it was that you went. To visit with Nancy?" Sophie panted louder and indicated that she needed to catch her breath first, and then after a few more moments she said, "I went to the public library." "By yourself?" asked Vivian. She could have sworn that when Sophie was leaving she had mentioned going out to meet Nancy or one of her other friends. "Yes," said Sophie. Vivian frowned. Sophie had not spent much time at the public library before. In fact, Vivian was not certain if she had ever spent any time there. "What is in the library?" "Books," said Sophie, as if speaking to an idiot. "I know that, but why did you go there? Don't you have enough to read here?" asked Vivian. "Reading is hardly the most suitable pastime for a young girl your age," said Vivian's mother. "Oh, yes, wonderful. Here it is," thought Vivian, the unhelpful veering off topic into a side matter, so that now I might never get to the bottom of why she went there. "I was looking for old editions of books," said Sophie, washing her hands and then sitting down at the table. At these words, a faint stirring of memory, suspicion, and doubt crept into Vivian's mind. But it was time to serve the dinner, and then Sophie began telling a story of what had happened to a classmate of hers recently, and the sensation passed. After dinner, Sophie got up and offered to wash the dishes, which she then did while singing happily along with the radio, which was playing "Come Fly With Me" by Frank Sinatra for about the millionth time. "See how sweet and helpful she is becoming now that she is older," Vivian's mother pointed out to Vivian. Vivian was surprised but happy for the help, and it is always a parent's joy to see one's child happy, so she just put it down to a good mood. Sophie spent each of the following afternoons away, either visiting one friend or another, or finally running out for fresh vegetables when they had run low. She had never been more consistently good-humored and high-spirited. It reminded Vivian of Chip at his best, when nothing in life could get him down or get the better of him. Sophie seemed to glow with happiness. Angela called to invite them to spend a weekend out in the Pennsylvania countryside with her and her family, and she asked how Sophie was doing. "Oh, she is a changed girl of late, always cheerful and helpful and smiling," said Vivian. Mark my words, there is a boy behind it," said Angela. "She is getting to that age, isn't she?" "A boy? But she is only 14. I'm not even certain that she knows any boys besides her classmates, and every girl knows that at that age, boy classmates are immature idiots," replied Vivian. Still, after she hung up the phone, Vivian watched Sophie more closely, asking her if there was any boy that she fancied in her school, and satisfying herself when Sophie flat out told her that she thought them all beneath her. A few weeks into this new state of things, with Vivian's mother having moved temporarily into their apartment, and Sophie helpfully and promptly doing everything that was asked of her, Vivian caught Sophie putting on lipstick in the bathroom, while ostensibly getting ready to go across town and see if she could take the toaster to a repairman so that he could see if it could be fixed. "Sophie, come into my room for a moment, would you?" Vivian said. How wonderful that her mother was right there in the same apartment with them as this conversation was going to be held. As it was enough to make Vivian sick. Sophie entered cautiously. Vivian shut the door behind her and indicated that Sophie was to sit down on the bed. "Now, hand me the lipstick," began Vivian. Sophie blushed and handed it over. "What is this all about? Who exactly is this for? I cannot imagine that it is for the benefit of the toaster repairman," said Vivian. No one," stammered Sophie. "There is a boy, isn't there?" said Vivian. "No, there isn't," began Sophie. But then she reversed course and said meekly, "Yes, there is." "Who is he, and where did you meet him?" asked Vivian harshly. "Out with it." Let's hope it wasn't in a bar while getting sloppy drunk on bourbon, she thought, wincing and remembering her own embarrassing youthful transgressions at an only slightly older age. He said he loved me," stammered Sophie, and tears came into the corners of her eyes. Panic came over Vivian. Just how far had this gone, whatever it was? He did not touch you inappropriately, did he, Sophie?" There was a pause, into which Vivian laid about 100 parental nightmares. "No," said Sophie in a small voice. We have never even kissed." Well, that was a huge relief. Vivian came over to sit beside Sophie on the bed and put an arm about her shoulders. "You had me very frightened there for a minute. Sophie, I know that you are growing up, and soon you will be a young woman, and rendezvous and courtship and marriage are all just around the corner. But at 14, maybe the corner is still a few years away, wouldn't you agree? You do not need to be looking out for beaux at this age. Soon the beaux will start showing up on their own, and they won't even need this tube of lipstick to bring them by. You are very beautiful, you know. You are also just very young still." "I was not out looking for a beau," said Sophie, wiping at her cheek with her sleeve. "But I couldn't help it." There, said Vivian, straightening out some twisted strands of Sophie's long hair. "Who is this beau? Tell me about him. How old is he?" "I don't know how old he is," said Sophie. Then she sighed. "It's Gregory Morgan, Mother." "What?" cried Vivian, dropping her hand away from Sophie's hair as if it had burned her. "What kind of shameful prank is this?" she shouted. "How dare you make a jest of this?" "It is no jest, Mother," said Sophie in a small, shaking voice. Vivian saw red. Then it started to turn black on the edges, and then she thought the better of it and sat back down on the bed, lest she topple over where she stood. She clutched at her forehead with her hand. "Oh, God," she groaned. "Oh, no, 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 no." It could be another Gregory Morgan, she realized, but what were the odds of that? She looked at Sophie with wide, panicked eyes. "What does he look like?" she asked in a voice as low as a whisper. "Just like he does in the picture," replied Sophie hollowly. "You went through my private items," Vivian said in a cold, accusatory tone. It wasn't a premeditated evil, said Sophie defensively. You had left an open box on your bed, and some pictures lay beside it. I was in some of those pictures. I know that he knew us once and bought me my bunny. I thought I deserved to know. To know what? Spat Vivian. Her whole body was shaking with rage. To know who he really was and what he had been like. I thought he may have been a kind of father to me, but then I met him, and he suddenly did not seem very father-like to me any more, said Sophie. Oh, I do not doubt that at all, thought Vivian. Listen, Grandmamma is on the other side of this wall, just in the living room. Not a word of this to her, or I will have your hide. Let us go down to her apartment and speak there. Get your shoes on. Sophie stomped out the door and down the apartment stairs, and Vivian followed her. This cannot be happening, Vivian thought. He is here. He does not want me any more. Well, why in hell would he? He is a handsome 28-year-old man, and I will shortly be facing 40. He wants Sophie now. I'm going to die. Oh, but that he would do this to me, after all of the heartbreak and anguish that we have already had between us. Did I somehow deserve this, too? Vivian unlocked the door to her mother's apartment, and Sophie walked in, sitting down on the sofa in the same spot where Gregory had used to sit when he had come calling on them. The blonde shine of her hair and the angry flash of her blue eyes made it briefly seem like Chip was in the room too, and the presence of all those ghosts left Vivian feeling disoriented. She sat down across from Sophie and tried to ignore the loud rattling of her own heart. Now tell me everything. What happened after you went through my private items? Well, I saw the letters, began Sophie. Vivian clutched at her head again, trying to recall what possibly incriminating thing was in them. I didn't read them, Sophie hastened to add. I swear I didn't. I just saw the return addresses on the envelopes and saw that most of them were from New Orleans, but some were from New York, and so I went to see where that address was. And it was the address of a business, of a book repair shop. Her voice trailed off. Yes, Gregory had always made it a custom of his to have his mail go to Mr. Gerstner's store. So then Sophie had gone to the book repair shop, where Mr. Gerstner had probably wondered who she was. Then what happened? Asked Vivian impatiently. Well, I thought I must have written the address down wrong or something, because there was no one inside but an old man at the store counter. But I had come so far already, and so I opened the door and asked the old man if he knew a Gregory Morgan. The old man gave me a long, strange look, then said yes in a heavy accent, and then walked away. He did not come back. Instead, a few moments later, Gregory appeared. Vivian closed her eyes, imagining each and every second of this interaction, and wishing that she could be young again and start over with him, and that things could be again as they had been when she and Nadine had gone to visit Gregory at the store back in New Orleans, when Nadine had brought her family Bible for ostensible repairs. Oh, handsome, ageless Gregory. Oh, I never truly loved any other, she thought. What did he say? She asked Sophie hoarsely. He recognized me. He asked if I was Sophie. I nodded and slid the picture across the counter to him, the one of me and him. He made a sigh and asked me if he might keep it. I'm sorry, Mother. I did not know what to do. I told him he could keep it. I'm so sorry. Sophie started crying again. "Then what did he say?" said Vivian, eager to hear every last thing that he had said, even though she knew it would hurt with the worst pain in the world to know it. He said that it was a small world, and that there was no coincidence in it at all. He said that he did not live in New York anymore, and was only visiting to help his friend, the bookstore owner, to pack up and move the store to a new location. He said that if I had come by half a year later, I would not have found anyone at the address at all who could have connected us. Sophie stood up, and at first Vivian thought she was going to walk back out of the apartment, but then she realized that she was only going to the bathroom for bathroom tissue to blow her nose into. She brought it back to the living room and sat back down on the sofa. Vivian was reeling from all of this information. Gregory was here. He was helping Mr. Gerstner to move the store. She should go and see him. And what? Have him see how old she had become in the decade since they had last met? To have to be compared to her own fantastically beautiful daughter, just on the cusp of blossoming into womanhood? No woman over 35 could hope to compete with a creature of Sophie's youth and beauty. Oh, it was too horrible, too horrible. Sophie continued her tale. He asked if I had some time to speak with him, and then he called into the back of the store that he was taking an hour off, and he grabbed his hat and walked me out. We went to a small street cafe where we sat down, and he bought me a lemonade. Vivian shivered in horror. The thought of her young daughter sitting with an extremely handsome adult man in a street cafe was awful. What if anyone had seen them? Was this what my mother felt like when she was told about me sitting at the Café du Monde with Gregory? She wondered. It sure felt very different to be on the other side of that situation now. She should have given me a thrashing, and she would have been justified, Vivian thought. He asked me about how we all were, and how things were at school, and then he asked me about you, Sophie continued. About me? What did he ask about me? Asked Vivian, tears already gathering in the corners of her eyes. He asked if you were all right, if you had met someone else and gotten married again, said Sophie in a low voice. And what did you tell him? Asked Vivian, her lower lip trembling in a vain attempt to keep the tears from rolling down her face. Sophie tore off some of the bath tissue and passed it over. I said you had not. He asked if you were sad, and I said that I really couldn't tell. Are you sad, Mother? Sophie asked. Well, sometimes, I suppose, said Vivian, unsure of what answer to give to this question. Then what did he say? He asked about our lives, if you still work at the insurance company, if we still live in our apartment, if I still have a pet bunny. He asked if Grandmama still sews. He wanted to know everything. I was afraid that I would be in trouble if I stayed out much longer, so I told him I had to go, and he asked me to come by again soon, while he was still in town, and so I did. Sophie blew her nose again. Vivian sighed. And then what? Well, each time I came, we would go out and talk, and he kept telling me stories from the past, about how he had bought me a wooden vase once to put flowers into. Is it the same one that is in my bedroom? Sophie wanted to know. It is, Vivian admitted. And he gave me my pet bunny. He said we used to play at soldiers together. I don't remember that at all, but I wish I did. He said he used to carry me home on his shoulders from Central Park. He said that one time we were caught in a shower of flower petals caused by a spring breeze. Vivian gave up the fight. She took off her glasses, set them down on the coffee table, dropped her head in her hands, and sobbed. Yes, this was the life we had, before I broke everything, before I threw it away, she thought. I used to think that perhaps there was some wisdom to this path, that at least my small daughter would not ever be in danger from this man who did not eat what other men eat. But then look at the other harm that I brought upon her, raised alone without a father, when this man loved her and would have been that father for her. But what would have happened when she grew older? Would they still be at this same grief, to have Sophie fall in love with his impossibly young, handsome face when she turned 14? Asked another part of her. There was no way to come out of this with anything other than pain. It had been a wonderful but unattainable dream. He is handsome, isn't he? Vivian asked, looking up from her hands, her voice full of cynicism. He is the handsomest man in the entire world, said Sophie, with the simple honesty of a child. Yes, he is, said Vivian, and it has caused him no end of troubles. Just about literally no end, she thought. Leave him alone. He's no good for you. Sophie threw down the crumpled-up bath tissue in her hand. Why? So that you can have him? I see how it is. But you are too old for him, Mother. I know I am too young, but if he can wait a few years, I could be a good wife to him. I know I could. Oh, he can wait a few years. Don't you worry about that, spat Vivian, her temper returning to match Sophie's new challenge. He can wait the rest of forever. Hearing that she was too old for Gregory Morgan hurt worse than she could ever have believed possible, and she thought that if her anger did not kill her, the pain of it would. But I love him, wailed Sophie. When he speaks to me, when he looks at me. I cannot bear to hear the rest of this sentence, thought Vivian. Enough! She shouted. This is precisely why silly girls of 14 are not to meet with grown men on their own without a chaperone. It is 1958, Mother. Nobody has chaperones anymore, cried Sophie. Well, more's the pity, retorted Vivian flatly. No wonder this world is going straight to hell in a handcart. You are not to speak to this man again. I forbid it. Do you understand? Sophie stuck her chin out and folded her arms under her armpits. No, I do not understand, she said stubbornly. Heavens, did I give my mother this much trouble when I was young, thought Vivian. She was about to stand up and grab Sophie by the hair, when she paused a moment to consider the situation. This was one of the benefits of being older and wiser, was it not? That one could pause and consider one's actions in a way that maybe had not been possible in one's youth. If she forbade Sophie from ever seeing Gregory again, Sophie would simply disobey and sneak off to see him nonetheless. Hadn't Sophie said that he was leaving the city soon? He could leave, and Vivian could make her wishes known to Mr. Gerstner, that Gregory not correspond with Sophie or return to New York for the next dozen years. By then, hopefully Sophie would be grown up, married off, and somebody else's problem. Yes, this was a good solution. Only one thing still hurt, still wasn't fixed, and that was that it seemed that Gregory had transferred his affections to Sophie now. Was this true? Vivian had to know. instead of getting up to throttle Sophie. Vivian took a deep breath, straightened out the folds in her skirt with her hands, and then looked up at her daughter, who really looked more miserable than rebellious at this moment. "You said he loves you. Did he say that?" she asked carefully. "Yes, he said that," said Sophie in a small voice, and Vivian immediately knew that it was true. "Then we shall do this. We will go to the store, and I will wait outside for you, and you will go in. Do not tell anyone that I am there. Go and ask to speak to Gregory again. Tell him that he has to make a choice, either to wait for you and correspond with you, or to be a person ever welcomed to cross the threshold of our home again. It cannot be both ways. If he wants you, he can have you, but he cannot have my good opinion as well. Tell him to make his choice," said Vivian coldly. Sophie's mouth fell open. "You would do this? You would do this to me, your only daughter? If this man agrees to have me for his wife one day, you would disown me?" "That is true, with one correction. Gregory Morgan will never take a wife," Vivian stated. "Why do you say that?" sobbed Sophie. "Because I know a thing or two about him. Go then and ask him if he would ever have you as a wife. See what he says. Why take my word for it? Get yourself ready. We will go over tomorrow, and you can ask him yourself," said Vivian. "You are only doing this because you're hateful and jealous of me," sobbed Sophie. "Oh, shut up already," muttered Vivian, wondering why this irritated her so much, and then surprising herself with the discovery that it was true, that Sophie was right, and that Vivian was jealous. "I was young once," she thought. "I lived with the dream of marrying Gregory Morgan one day, and see where it led me, into the arms of a no-good British adventurer who turned out to be a criminal as well, into this life where I live all alone with my inner heart, consoling myself, supporting myself, keeping myself going as best as I can. This suffering has stamped itself on my face. The frown lines will never erase themselves from my skin. I've become used up in the effort to love, win, and hold on to the elusive and uncatchable, mysterious Gregory Morgan. And yes, the mere thought that you might do better, might succeed where I failed, fills me with a poisoned bitterness." "Dry your face. Let's go upstairs," she said out loud. "Grandmama will be wondering what has happened with us. And I warn you, one word to her about Gregory Morgan, and I will ensure that you never get to see him again. Do we understand each other?" asked Vivian, putting her glasses back on, standing up, and moving toward the door. Sophie nodded miserably, and then followed. No other mother and daughter would have to face something like this, something so gruesome that it made Vivian's flesh crawl. It was all because of Gregory's unnatural nature, she thought as they walked back upstairs. Well, that, and the fact that only someone as emotionally naive as Gregory would be fool enough to tell an impressionable young 14-year-old girl that he loved her, without stopping to think how that might go to her head. Unless he did mean for it to go to her head. Unless he really loved her now. The next day was conveniently Sunday, and Vivian told her mother that she was taking Sophie for a mother-daughter walk in the park. Sophie was sullen and silent. "The skip has certainly gone out of her step," agreed Vivian's mother. "What do you suppose is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong, Mother. It's just this age that she's going through. 1 week everything is roses, The next, it is ashes," said Vivian, and then she called into the back of the apartment, "Sophie, are you ready to go?" Sophie stepped out of her bedroom and into the hallway. She looked so beautiful that Vivian almost choked. Her young girl's face was pale. Her hair was brushed to a bright luster and had been pulled back in a low ponytail. She was wearing a light blue sweater that made the most of her eyes, and her eyelashes set off her expression to perfection. "Gregory hopelessly loves children and flowers and all beautiful things," she could hear Mr. Gerstner saying. Gregory could never hope to resist Sophie. Sophie would go in and ask him if he would ever marry her, and he would break down feebly and gasp yes. She could wind him around her little finger, Vivian realized. Well, it was too late for a change of plan. "Get your shoes on," she said to Sophie, and then they said goodbye to Vivian's mother and walked out. The journey across town was strained and silent. What will happen next? Thought Vivian. What if she runs off with him? What if he lets her? She is too young, but I was hardly all that much older when he met me in Charity Hospital. I have loved him, despite everything, for all of these years, and now at last I will know if he still loves me also, or if he has given me up. Oh, I need to know, and yet I cannot bear to know. Vivian looked across at Sophie, who was nervously knotting up the edge of her sweater's cuff with her fist. She must be suffering too, the wiser and more mature voice inside of Vivian pointed out. Oh, what a fine pair we make. See what you have wrought, Gregory. And all because you couldn't age like a normal man. At last they got out of the subway and walked until they reached the street where the store was, and Vivian could see men carrying boxes out of it and loading them into a large truck. Go inside and see if Gregory is there, said Vivian. I'm going to be in the next block, in the cafe we passed just now. Sophie nodded and crossed the street. Vivian turned to go, then stopped and went over to the truck where the loaders were working. Where is the store moving to? She asked. Out to somewhere in White Plains, one of the men told her. White Plains? So not all that far, then. Vivian thanked him and went back down the street to wait in the cafe. It was the longest wait she had ever waited. She ordered a black coffee, but then did not have the strength to pick it up and drink it. She stared at it and tried to imagine what was going on at the bookstore. He was right here. He was so close. He was so close, and yet she somehow inherently knew that she could not go and see him. She looked at her watch. Time passed at the slowest pace that time had ever passed in her entire life. A half-hour passed, then another 10 minutes more. What will I do if my only child has in fact run off with him? Thought Vivian. I sent my only child into a den of hungry lions, all because I selfishly wanted to know if Gregory Morgan still loved me. How could I have done this thing? What kind of a mother am I? Oh, I should die of shame. 3/4 of an hour later, Sophie reappeared, her head hanging down and tears streaming down her face. He doesn't love me, she said, sitting down. It's you he loves. Vivian couldn't breathe. See this broken thing. This is your young child, with a shattered heart, all on your account, said one voice in her mind. But he loves you still. He loves you still, cried another. Oh, Vivian exhaled, and then her own tears came. What did he say? Sophie looked miserable. He was not happy. He said he was very sorry, and that he is immediately going away again. He said he loves me like a father loves a daughter, but that is all it would ever be, and then he said goodbye. When I asked him to explain, he said he is not free to love anyone because his heart is given to another. I asked if it was given to you, and he... What did he say? Vivian repeated. I will never tell you, said Sophie coldly. Do I need you to gloat over me with your victory? No, it isn't like that, began Vivian, trying to put a hand on Sophie's arm, but Sophie yanked her arm away. You always said you loved me, but you love him more than me, cried Sophie. No, Sophie, no, began Vivian. But then she realized with horror that it was true. What defense could she give? You got to see him, got to speak to him, and I don't even get to hear what he said? Sophie gave her an accusing look, her eyes flashing with anger. Oh, how I hate you, she spat out between clenched teeth. You got what you came for. Now let me go home. I hate you, you selfish witch. You don't understand anything, retorted Vivian. You're just a child. Sophie gave her mother the most loathing-filled look that she had ever given her, her eyes bloodshot with tears. Oh, don't I, though? She stood up. I'm going home. Yes, agreed Vivian, drying her eyes on her handkerchief before putting it back into her pocketbook. And we shall never speak of this again. We shall never speak of it again, echoed Sophie hollowly. And then they walked out, got on the subway, and began their silent ride home. When they returned home, Vivian went to her bedroom, ready to cry in her pillow, as she took off her glasses to place them on her night table. William Wainwright's ship voyage brochure caught her eye. I cannot go through with this, she thought. No matter how pleasant it is for me to have a companion, I need to tell him goodbye. If I didn't know it already, I was just sharply reminded that I love another, and that this other is not dead, no matter how many lies about it I tell to someone like William Wainwright. Sophie was not always angry with Vivian after the entire brief exchange with Gregory Morgan, but trust was lost between them as a result of that experience that could never be entirely rebuilt, and Vivian's world went back to a few shades darker again, more as it had been before. I'm just not cut out for happiness in this world, she thought grimly. Gregory, I would rather be miserable, but know that I have your love, than to have any other joy in existence. Forgive me for it, all of you.
I can see